of God. 3. Relation of the being and attributes of God. Some dogmaticians devote a separate chapter or chapters to the being of God, before taking up the discussion of his attributes. This is done, for instance, in the works of Maastricht, Ebrard, Kuyper, and Shedd. Others prefer to consider the being of God in connection with his attributes in view of the fact that it is in these that he has revealed himself. This is the more common method, which is followed in the Synopsis Purioris Theologiae, and in the works of Turretin, A. Mark, Berkhof, Bavinck, Hodge, and Honig. This difference of treatment is not indicative of any serious fundamental disagreement between them. They are all agreed that the attributes are not mere names to which no reality corresponds, nor separate parts of a composite God, but essential qualities in which the being of God is revealed and with which it can be identified. The only difference would seem to be that some seek to distinguish between the being and the attributes of God more than others do. The being of God. It is quite evident that the being of God does not admit of any scientific definition. In order to give a logical definition of God, we would have to begin by going in search of some higher concept, under which God could be coordinated with other concepts, and would then have to point out the characteristics that would be applicable to God only. Such a genetic, synthetic definition cannot be given of God, since God is not one of several species of gods, which can be subsumed under a single genus. At most only an analytical, descriptive definition is possible. This merely names the characteristics of a person or thing, but leaves the essential being unexplained. And even such a definition cannot be complete, but only partial, because it is impossible to give an exhaustive positive, as opposed to negative, description of God. It would consist in an enumeration of all the known attributes of God, and these are to a great extent negative in character. The Bible never operates with an abstract concept of God, but always describes him as the living God, who enters into various relations with his creatures, relations which are indicative of several different attributes. In Kuyper's Dictaten Dogmatique de Doi, p. 28, we are told that God, personified as wisdom, speaks of his essence in Prov. 8:14, when he ascribes to himself Tashiach, a Hebrew word rendered wezen in the Holland translation. But this rendering is very doubtful, and the English rendering, counsel, deserves preference. It has also been pointed out that the Bible speaks of the nature of God in 2 Pet. 1-4, but this can hardly refer to the essential being of God, for we are not made partakers of the divine essence. An indication of the very essence of God has been found in the name Jehovah, as interpreted by God himself, I am that I am. On the basis of this passage, the essence of God was found in being itself, abstract being. And this has been interpreted to mean self-existence or self-contained permanence or absolute independence. Another passage is repeatedly quoted as containing an indication of the essence of God, and as the closest approach to a definition that is found in the Bible, namely, John chapter 4 verse 24, God is spirit, and they that worship him must worship in spirit and truth. This statement of Christ is clearly indicative of the spirituality of God. The two ideas derived from these passages occur repeatedly in theology as designations of the very being of God. On the whole, it may be said that Scripture does not exalt one attribute of God at the expense of the others, but represents them as existing in perfect harmony in the divine being. It may be true that now one, and then another attribute is stressed, but Scripture clearly intends to give due emphasis to every one of them. The being of God is characterized by a depth, a fullness, a variety, and a glory far beyond our comprehension, and the Bible represents it as a glorious harmonious whole, without any inherent contradictions. And this fullness of life finds expression in no other way than in the perfections of God. Some of the early Church Fathers were clearly under the influence of Greek philosophy in the doctrine of God and, as Seeberg expresses it, did not advance beyond the mere abstract conception that the divine being is absolute attributeless existence. For some time theologians were rather generally inclined to emphasize the transcendence of God, and to assume the impossibility of any adequate knowledge or definition of the divine essence. During the Trinitarian controversy, the distinction between the one essence and the three persons in the Godhead was strongly emphasized, but the essence was generally felt to be beyond human comprehension. Gregory of Nazianze, however, ventures to say, so far as we can discern, ho-on and ho-theos are somehow more than other terms the names of the divine essence, and of these ho-on is the preferable. He regards this as a description of absolute being. Augustine's conception of the essence of God was closely akin to that of Gregory. In the Middle Ages too there was a tendency, either to deny that man has any knowledge of the essence of God, or to reduce such knowledge to a minimum. In some cases one attribute was singled out as most expressive of the essence of God. Thus Thomas Aquinas spoke of his aseity or self-existence, and Duns Scotus, of his infinity. It became quite common also to speak of God as actus purus in view of his simplicity. The Reformers and their successors also spoke of the essence of God as incomprehensible, but they did not exclude all knowledge of it, though Luther used very strong language on this point. They stressed the unity, simplicity, and spirituality of God. The words of the Belgic Confession are quite characteristic. We all believe with the heart, and confess with the mouth, that there is one only simple and spiritual being, which we call God. Art. Later on philosophers and theologians found the essence of God in abstract being, in universal substance, in pure thought, in absolute causality, in love, in personality, and in majestic holiness or the numinous. B. The possibility of knowing the being of God. From the preceding it already appears that the question as to the possibility of knowing God in his essential being engaged the best minds of the Church from the earliest centuries. And the consensus of opinion in the early Church, during the Middle Ages, and at the time of the Reformation, was that God in his inmost being is the incomprehensible one. And in some cases the language used is so strong that it seemingly allows of no knowledge of the being of God whatsoever. At the same time they who use it, at least in some cases, seem to have considerable knowledge of the being of God. Misunderstanding can easily result from a failure to understand the exact question under consideration, and from neglecting to discriminate between knowing and comprehending. The scholastics spoke of three questions to which all the speculations respecting the divine being could be reduced, namely, and sit Deus, quid sit Deus, and qualis sit Deus. The first question concerns the existence of God, the second, his nature or essence, and the third, his attributes. In this paragraph it is particularly the second question that calls for attention. The question then is, what is God? What is the nature of his inner constitution? What makes him to be what he is? In order to answer that question adequately, we would have to be able to comprehend God and to offer a satisfactory explanation of his divine being, and this is utterly impossible. The finite cannot comprehend the infinite. The question of Zophar, canst thou by searching find out God? Canst thou find out the Almighty unto perfection? Job chapter 11 verse 7, has the force of a strong negative. And if we consider the second question entirely apart from the third, our negative answer becomes even more inclusive. Apart from the revelation of God in his attributes, we have no knowledge of the being of God whatsoever. But in so far as God reveals himself in his attributes, we also have some knowledge of his divine being, though even so our knowledge is subject to human limitations. Luther uses some very strong expressions respecting our inability to know something of the being or essence of God. On the one hand he distinguishes between the Deus absconditus, hidden God, and the Deus revelatus, revealed God, but on the other hand he also asserts that in knowing the Deus revelatus, we only know him in his hiddenness. By this he means that even in his revelation God has not manifested himself entirely as he is essentially, but as to his essence still remains shrouded in impenetrable darkness.
We know God only insofar as he enters into relations with us. Calvin too speaks of the divine essence as incomprehensible.
He holds that God in the depths of his being is past finding out. Speaking of the knowledge of the quid and of the quales of God, he says that it is rather useless to speculate about the former, while our practical interest lies in the latter.
Says he, they are merely toying with frigid speculations whose mind is set on the question of what God is quid sit deus, when what it really concerns us to know is rather what kind of a person he is qualis sit, and what is appropriate to his nature.
Inst. I 2.2. While he feels that God cannot be known to perfection, he does not deny that we can know something of his being or nature. But this knowledge cannot be obtained by a priori methods, but only in an a posteriori manner through the attributes, which he regards as real determinations of the nature of God.
They convey to us at least some knowledge of what God is, but especially of what he is in relation to us.
In dealing with our knowledge of the being of God, we must certainly avoid the position of cousin, rather rare in the history of philosophy, that God even in the depths of his being is not at all incomprehensible but essentially intelligible. But we must also steer clear of the agnosticism of Hamilton and Mansell, according to which we can have no knowledge whatsoever of the being of God. We cannot comprehend God, cannot have an absolute and exhaustive knowledge of him, but we can undoubtedly have a relative or partial knowledge of the divine being. It is perfectly true that this knowledge of God is possible only because he has placed himself in certain relations to his moral creatures and has revealed himself to them, and that even this knowledge is humanly conditioned, but it is nevertheless real and true knowledge, and is at least a partial knowledge of the absolute nature of God.
There is a difference between an absolute knowledge and a relative or partial knowledge of an absolute being.
It will not do at all to say that man knows only the relations in which God stands to his creatures. It would not even be possible to have a proper conception of these relations without knowing something of both God and man. To say that we can know nothing of the being of God, but can know only relations, is equivalent to saying that we cannot know him at all and cannot make him the object of our religion. Dr. Orr says, we may not know God in the depths of his absolute being, but we can at least know him in so far as he reveals himself in his relation to us. The question, therefore, is not as to the possibility of a knowledge of God in the unfathomableness of his being, but is, can we know God as he enters into relations with the world and with ourselves? God has entered into relations with us in his revelations of himself, and supremely in Jesus Christ. And we Christians humbly claim that through this self-revelation we do know God to be the true God, and have real acquaintance with his character and will. Neither is it correct to say that this knowledge which we have of God is only a relative knowledge. It is in part a knowledge of the absolute nature of God as well. Sidelights on Christian Doctrine, p. 11. The last statements are probably intended to ward off the idea that all our knowledge of God is merely relative to the human mind, so that we have no assurance that it corresponds with the reality as it exists in God.
See the being of God revealed in his attributes.
From the simplicity of God it follows that God and his attributes are one. The attributes cannot be considered as so many parts that enter into the composition of God, for God is not, like men, composed of different parts. Neither can they be regarded as something added to the being of God, though the name, derived from ad and tribuere, might seem to point in that direction, for no addition was ever made to the being of God, who is eternally perfect.
It is commonly said in theology that God's attributes are God himself, as he has revealed himself to us. The scholastics stressed the fact that God is all that he has.
He has life, light, wisdom, love, righteousness, and it may be said on the basis of Scripture that he is life, light, wisdom, love, and righteousness. It was further asserted by the scholastics that the whole essence of God is identical with each one of the attributes, so that God's knowing is God, God's willing is God, and so on. Some of them even went so far as to say that each attribute is identical with every other attribute, and that there are no logical distinctions in God. This is a very dangerous extreme. While it may be said that there is an interpenetration of the attributes in God, and that they form a harmonious whole, we are moving in the direction of pantheism, when we rule out all distinctions in God, and say that his self-existence is his infinity, his knowing is his willing, his love is his righteousness, and vice versa. It was characteristic of the nominalists that they obliterated all real distinctions in God. They were afraid that by assuming real distinctions in him, corresponding to the attributes ascribed to God, they would endanger the unity and simplicity of God, and were therefore motivated by a laudable purpose. According to them, the perfections of the divine being exist only in our thoughts, without any corresponding reality in the divine being. The realists, on the other hand, asserted the reality of the divine perfections. They realized that the theory of the nominalists, consistently carried out, would lead in the direction of a pantheistic denial of a personal God, and therefore considered it of the utmost importance to maintain the objective reality of the attributes in God. At the same time, they sought to safeguard the unity and simplicity of God by maintaining that the whole essence is in each attribute. God is all in each. Thomas Aquinas had the same purpose in mind, when he asserted that the attributes do not reveal what God is in himself, in the depths of his being, but only what he is in relation to his creatures. Naturally, we should guard against separating the divine essence and the divine attributes or perfections, and also against a false conception of the relation in which they stand to each other. The attributes are real determinations of the divine being, or, in other words, qualities that inhere in the being of God. Shedd speaks of them as an analytical and closer description of the essence. Dome. Theol. I. p. 334. In a sense they are identical, so that it can be said that God's perfections are God himself as he has revealed himself to us. It is possible to go even farther and say with Shedd, the whole essence is in each attribute, and the attribute in the essence. Ibid. p. 334. And because of the close relation in which the two stand to each other, it can be said that knowledge of the attributes carries with it knowledge of the divine essence. It would be a mistake to conceive of the essence of God as existing by itself and prior to the attributes, and of the attributes as additive and accidental characteristics of the divine being. They are essential qualities of God, which inhere in his very being and are coexistent with it. These qualities cannot be altered without altering the essential being of God. And since they are essential qualities, each one of them reveals to us some aspect of the being of God. Questions for further study. How can we distinguish between the being, the nature, and the essence of God? How do the philosophical views of the essential being of God generally differ from the theological views? How about the tendency to find the essence of God in the absolute, in love, or in personality? What does Otto mean when he characterizes it as the holy, or the numinous? Why is it impossible for man to comprehend God? Has sin in any way affected man's ability to know God? Is there any difference between Luther's and Barth's conception of the hidden God? Does Calvin differ from them on this point? Did Luther share the nominalist views of Occam, by whom he was influenced in other respects? How did the Reformers, in distinction from the Scholastics, consider the problem of the existence of God? Could we have any knowledge of God, if he were pure attributeless being? What erroneous views of the attributes should be avoided? What is the proper view? Literature. Bavinck, Geref. Dome. I. pp. 91 to 113, Kuiper, Dict. Dome. De Dio I, pp. 124 to 158, Hodge, Sist. Theol. I, pp. 335 to 374, Shed, Dome. Theol. I, pp. 152 to 194, Thornwell, Collected Works, I, pp. 104 to 172, Dorner, Sist. Of Chr. Doct. I, pp. 187 to 212, or Chr. View of God and the World, pp. 75 to 93, Otten, Manual of the Hist. Of Dogmas I, pp. 254 to 260, Clark, The Chr. Doct. Of God, pp. 56 to 70, Steenstra, The Being of God as Unity and Trinity, pp. 1 to 88, Thompson, The Christian Idea of God, pp. 117 to 159, Hendry, God the Creator, From the Barthian Standpoint, Warfield, Calvin and Calvinism, pp. 131 to 185, Calvin's Doctrine of God.